Accessibility Guidelines. Lesson Plan for Accessibility Fundamentals, WCAG. By Edupro Hub.
How to meet WCAG, Part 5. Level AA, Principle 1, Perceivable. Guideline 1.2, Time-Based Media. 1.2.4 Captions, Live. For live synchronized media, every audio content must include captions. For a live broadcast, provide captions. Whenever live captioning is supported, use media players or broadcast platforms. 1.2.5 Audio Description, Pre-recorded. Ensure that the pre-recorded video content in the synchronized media has an audio description. Where a visual component isn't mentioned in the video's dialogue, provide audio descriptions. The audio description can either be separate from the original video or be an integral part of the video. Scene changes, settings, dialogue-driven actions, and any other visual information that cannot be expressed through speech or dialogue must all be included in the audio description. Use media players that support audio descriptions. Guideline 1.3 Adaptable. 1.3.4 Orientation. Unless a specific display orientation is required, content does not limit its view and operation to a single display orientation, such as portrait or landscape. Don't limit your app or website to only working in landscape or portrait mode. While presenting the program in landscape or portrait mode, be sure to respect the device settings. 1.3.5 Identify Input Purpose. The purpose of each input field gathering user information can be identified programmatically when the input field fulfills a function mentioned in the section titled Input Purposes for User Interface Components. The content is implemented with technologies that can detect the expected meaning of form input data. Provide input purposes that can be determined programmatically. Apply the correct token values when using the autocomplete attribute. Use autocomplete sparingly in input boxes that don't request user information. Guideline 1.4, Distinguishable. 1.4.3 Contrast, Minimum. Make sure that the contrast between the text and its background is kept at a minimum of 4.5:1. In the event of text-based image contrast, this minimum contrast ratio should also be maintained. Create the style guide so that any text that is essential meets the required minimum contrast. Pick color schemes that are sufficiently contrasted for everyone to be able to see and read them. If you are unable to design and develop the content with a minimum required contrast, then provide a contrast mode with the aid of an alternative CSS. Guideline 1.4, Distinguishable. 1.4.3 Contrast, Minimum. Make sure that the contrast between the text and its background is kept at a minimum of 4.5:1. In the event of text-based image contrast, this minimum contrast ratio should also be maintained. Create the style guide so that any text that is essential meets the required minimum contrast. Pick color schemes that are sufficiently contrasted for everyone to be able to see and read them. If you are unable to design and develop the content with a minimum required contrast, then provide a contrast mode with the aid of an alternative CSS. 1.4.4 Resize Text. Make sure the text can be resized up to 200% without losing any content or usefulness or using any assistive technologies. Provide an alternative CSS style sheet for scaling purposes in cases when the zoom feature is not supported or provided by the browser, i.e. 6, for instance. Make sure there isn't a lot of horizontal scrolling when zoomed out to 200%. A best practice. If there are any lengthy user interface elements or content, such as an email subject line, truncate them and provide means to retrieve the material along with the instructions. 1.4.5 Images of text. Instead of visuals of text, use real text as much as feasible. Instead of bitmap graphics, use headers with CSS styling. When there are dynamically generated text images, provide site-wide controls to customize them. Any UI elements, including their words, icons, quotes, and alignment, can have spacing, color, and font family specifications made using CSS. Instead of creating symbols as images, if possible, use keyboard-generated symbols. January 4, 2010 Reflow. Content can be presented in 2 dimensions without losing information or functionality, and without requiring scrolling for vertical scrolling content at a width equivalent to 320 CSS pixels, horizontal scrolling content at a height equivalent to 256 CSS pixels. Except for those portions of the information whose usage or meaning need a 2-dimensional layout. From the beginning of the design process, use responsive web design, RWD. Avoid using horizontal scroll bars in 400% zoom by using accessible links, modals, and toggle-type components to show or conceal content. Refrain from content overlapping, cutting, losing content, and losing functionality. January 4, 2011 Non-text contrast. The following visual presentations have a contrast ratio of at least 3:1 against adjacent colors. Components of the user interface. Except for inactive components or when the appearance of the component is determined by the user agent, and not modified by the author, visual information is required to identify user interface components and states. Graphical objects. Parts of graphics required to understand the content, unless a specific presentation of graphics is required to convey the information. Ensure hit areas and focus indicators have 3:1 contrast ratio with their inner or outer background. Ensure the checked/unchecked states meet the 3:1 ratio against their adjacent color in order to distinguish the states. Ensure parts of graphs and charts where color is the only way to decipher the information, the contrast ratio is met against adjacent colors. Ensure appropriate color combinations are chosen and defined for UI elements and other graphical objects in the style guides and the design documents in order to avoid uncomfortable retrofitting. January 4, 2012 Text spacing. There is no loss of functionality or content in content created with markup languages that support the following text style properties when all of them are set to the same value. Line height, line spacing, should be at least 1.5 times the font size, paragraph spacing should be at least 2 times the font size, letter spacing, tracking, should be at least 0.12 times the font size, and word spacing should be at least 0.16 times the font size. Exception: human languages and scripts that do not use one or more of these text style properties in written text can conform by using only the properties that are available for that language and script combination. In your CSS styles, avoid using fixed containers. Check that the content reflows without any overlapping or text cutoffs. Font size, line height, and space between characters, words, lines, and paragraphs should all be measured in relative units. January 4, 2013 Content on hover or focus. The following are true when receiving and then removing pointer hover or keyboard focus causes additional content to become visible and then hidden. Dismissible: there is a mechanism for dismissing the additional content without moving the pointer hover. Unless the additional content communicates an input error or does not, keyboard focus is required. Other content is obscured or replaced. Hoverable: if the pointer can trigger the additional content, the pointer can be moved over the additional content without it disappearing. Persistent: the extra content remains visible until the hover or focus trigger is removed, the user dismisses it, or the information it contains is no longer valid. The author cannot change the visual presentation of the additional content because it is controlled by the user agent. Give users a way to dismiss the extra content that appears when they hover over it or give a keyboard focus. Ensure that content remains visible until the user moves the mouse pointer away from the triggering element or content block. Make certain that the experience is consistent. Thank you and please stay tuned for the next lesson.